I know it's just a little after 6. We're going to wait for our um, attendees to keep coming in, and they're filling up now. Okay, hello and welcome to the latest PediaTrust Q&A Ask the Pediatrician webinar entitled Kids 101. My name is Ruben Rucoba. I'm the medical director for PediaTrust and your host for tonight's session. Our panel tonight includes Dr. Anna Laufter, pediatrician at Fairview Pediatrics in Grayslake, Dr. Kristi Ward, pediatrician at Premier Pediatrics with offices in Lincolnshire and Gurnee, and Dr. Tom Roberts, pediatrician at Wheaton Pediatrics with offices in Wheaton and Batavia. Our session tonight will be about an hour long. We'll finish up sometime right around 7, and it will be recorded. We'll be sending an email to everyone who registered for this event in the next few days with a link to that recording. We've had questions coming in for the last 2 weeks, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. But those of you watching tonight can also submit questions either through the chat function of the Zoom call or to those of you watching through Facebook Live. And we'll try to get to some of those questions as well. So Dr. Laufter, this first question is for you. One parent of a newborn wants to know the best way to keep newborns and infants stimulated and engaged. What advice do you have for that parent?
So there are many ways to engage your newborn, and many of these things parents are probably already doing, but we do recommend, most importantly, reading to your baby and just speaking around your baby, playing music for the baby, dancing with the baby, playing on the floor with the baby, giving hugs and cuddles and taking him or her for walks in the stroller, offering soft toys, and doing some tracking exercises with some soft toys as well. So lots and lots of things you can do on a daily basis that are pretty simple.
Good to hear. And I would just reiterate what Dr. Laufter said about reading and talking to your children as much as possible, particularly at a newborn age. I know they're not going to talk for about a year, but language development happens, it starts even in the womb. They can hear pretty well at birth, unlike their vision, which is not very good at birth, but their hearing is very good at birth. So talk as much as you can to your baby, read to your baby. And the baby needs to hear both the male and the female voice. The male voice is uses a different tone, different structures, different vocabulary. So make sure that the baby gets to hear male and female voices throughout the day. Dr. Roberts, you had this experience recently. One parent wants to know, how do you help an only child, 2 years old, get ready for their siblings' arrival?
It's a challenging thing to go through, and as soon as you're comfortable, I recommend discussing with them on their level. You know, the new baby's coming, the baby's in mommy's belly, the baby will be outside. Have them buy a gift for the baby, or if you break up your shopping for new things into a couple trips every time they go, they can pick out something special and they can put it somewhere in the nursery where the baby's going to be able to use it. I'd talk about a schedule. And I'd kind of talk a little bit, I'll divide this up into what to do before and what to do after, but I'd kind of on their level talk about the schedule, what the baby's going to do throughout the day. When When the baby comes home at some point, they're probably going to recommend you take them back to the hospital. I definitely got that. They were done with them. But I think it'd be important if you can kind of divide and conquer between the parents, that each of you take time to do something with them each day alone that doesn't involve the new baby. So they kind of have an interaction with each parent and know that they're still special. No matter what you do, there's going to be jealousy just because they're not going to be able to understand not having mom and dad all to themselves. So if you go through all these steps and do everything correctly, it's still going to be a fairly challenging thing. And then I think a big thing is going to be to include them as much as possible on their level in the care of the baby. So if you're changing them, can you bring me the diaper? When the bottle's, heated up or whatever, can you bring the bottle to me? Can you bring a big toy to the baby? Just trying to incorporate that into your kind of thought throughout the day, and that should help make the transition as best as possible. But it's still generally a challenging thing.
No doubt. Dr. Ward, as a working mom, I'm sure you can appreciate this question. One mother writes, I'm returning back to work. I'm afraid my baby will not recognize me anymore since I won't be with him all the time. And what do you tell that worried mom?
So I can definitely sympathize with that mom. The transition back to work is a really hard one, and I'm not sure that it gets easier each time you do it with each child. Going from being baby's primary caregiver 24/7, doing everything that the baby needs, and then allowing somebody else kind of into that space to fill your shoes can be really, really tough. A lot of parents have mixed emotions when they start going back to work. So a lot of parents feel guilty, they feel worried, anxious. Some people are really excited, a little bit relieved. Those are all normal. But to that mom specifically, I would tell her that your role as a parent is a really special one. So you will always be number one to that baby. Remember, you've spent the last however many days, weeks, months, however long your leave is, kind of forming that really special bond. And you can have the best daycare provider, the best nanny, you could have Mary Poppins herself, but that baby will not forget you. And they will be really excited at the end of the day, no matter how long of a day it is, to come home to you. Even if they cry when you pick them up, that just means they forgot how much they missed you. And some of the things to help sort of ease that transition: one, do your research. There are a lot of options out there for childcare, whether you're lucky enough to have family who can help, a daycare center, a nanny, a babysitter. There's lots of options, and you really need to feel comfortable with wherever you're going to be leaving your children. So as much research and really trusting your gut, picking something you feel comfortable with, I think is really helpful. And for that actual week back to work, maybe a trial run, like a day where you practice a little bit ahead of time, get all the things together that you need, practice the drop off, practice the pickup, maybe take a nap while your baby's there. But some of those things can help ease that week. It gets easier with time, for sure.
That sounds great. And if you have Mary Poppins' phone number, Dr. Ward, I'd appreciate it.
Sure.
So Dr. Laufter, one parent writes in, does a 3-year-old need to drink milk if she eats a lot of dairy?
We get this question in the office all the time. As babies evolve into toddlers, often their dietary preferences change and they often get pickier. So the answer is no, but as long as you're monitoring the other intake of dairy, there are many options, and there are plenty of equivalents that you can find online, food pyramids, lots of information that will give you equivalents for what a 3-year-old should be taking. So we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 2 cups of just pure milk at that age, but other alternatives would be things like cheese in the form of either hard cheese, ricotta cheese, cottage cheese, slices of cheese, yogurts, dairy-based puddings, frozen yogurt, ice cream. I'm sure a lot of kids are getting that in the summer anyway. You can put yogurt in smoothies if they don't like just taking yogurt by itself. And soy equivalents are really, really good if your child can't tolerate dairy. So in short, many, many options besides just plain cups of milk if your child isn't interested. And I'm sure your pediatrician or the PediaTrust nutritionist can help you with that if you need.
Good point. picky eating is something that almost every child will go through at some point, but if it becomes a major issue, you can bring it up with your pediatrician. And obviously, as Dr. Laufter mentioned, we do have nutritionists at PediaTrust that can either consult with you personally in the office or through a telemedicine visit, and they can offer really good advice. All right, Dr. Roberts, one parent wants to know how to deal with mild tics, T-I-C-S, not T-I-C-K. These happen mostly when the child is anxious. What do you tell that parent?
What you're describing is pretty typical for simple ticks, and the natural course for most ticks is they're going to last anywhere from 6 to 12, sometimes 18 months. And they're going to happen more when they're nervous. Your child may be suppressing it throughout the day, and when they're in somewhere where they're alone, they might do it more. It's kind of feeling like an itch that they need to scratch, is the way people describe it. They are harmless. In the cases where the tics are severe or they're causing a lot of social distress, an option is to see a neurologist who would offer a medication that may help. That's a rare thing to do. You know, in a busy practice, you're maybe sending 1 or 2 kids a year that direction. But for the most part, know that they may be distressing to see, but they are harmless, and generally they will go away on their own.
Good to know. Thank you. So now we actually have a couple of questions about picky eating, following up on the question earlier. Dr. Ward, this first question is for you. How do you deal with tweens, specifically tweens, not younger kids, who are picky eaters?
So, when we talk about picky eating, we are often talking about toddlers because they're notorious picky eaters. But really similar to toddlers, that tween, like pre-adolescent age group is really struggling for independence, which is very similar to toddlers. But they're trying to figure out their place in life, which is a great thing in general, but sometimes can, steer them down the path of becoming a picky eater. Maybe it's lifelong. You've been struggling with it since they were toddlers. And maybe it's a new thing. It's often tied, if you see it in that age group, to peer pressure or increased social awareness. Maybe they want to be vegetarian because they don't want to eat animals, or maybe they start refusing certain foods because their friend doesn't eat it anymore. And so that's, what they've decided they want to do. Some of the, things for picky eating kind of goes across the board. So, I think the number one thing I always tell people is really avoid food battles in general. We know from toddlers that parents are always the losers. Kids are they always win. They have control over what goes into their mouth. And so, really sitting there and arguing about eating the vegetables or eating this and that really isn't a very good strategy. We always talk about eating in terms of division of responsibility. So, as parents, for that age group, you're still buying what's in the house. And you're still often doing a lot of the cooking and serving up the meals. So, making sure that those things are healthy, really stocking your house with healthy options, but also not swinging so far the other way and not making foods completely off limits, because that usually backfires. And then that's the favored food. But different from toddlers, you definitely can educate tweens and those pre-adolescents about healthy food choices without nagging them, but explain, why fruits and vegetables are healthy, what they do for your body, why protein is really important, how food ends up being fuel for your body and what it actually does for you. And then I think it's really helpful to involve kids in meal prep, and it might be really a fun way to kind of, spend some time with your kids, get them in the kitchen, let them plan a meal or a different way to cook a vegetable, let them help you shop and do some of the actual prep work, chopping and grating, stirring things. Kids at that age group can be really helpful in the kitchen. It can be a really, fun way to spend some time together.
That's great advice. As a follow-up question, Dr. Ward, since we're talking about tweens, what signs should parents look for that might indicate an eating disorder in either tweens or teenagers?
Yeah, eating disorders sometimes can be difficult to spot, but a lot of times you're looking from changes from what you've seen previously. So, of course, like a sudden decrease in weight, making critical comments about their own body or about other people's bodies in general, a change in exercise or eating habits, feeling suddenly uncomfortable to eat around other people sometimes, would be a warning sign. And then a preoccupation with food, calories, fat, fat grams, their weight, the numbers on the scale, or tracking those things like keeping track of calories, that sort of stuff. And then some of the symptoms can be really nonspecific. So headaches, stomach aches, dizziness, fatigue, things that could obviously be other things. And so, if you have any concerns about your child's eating or, some symptoms that you're seeing, definitely reach out to your pediatrician.
Thank you. All right. Continuing on with the picky eating theme, we know that this is a common problem at all ages, not just for tweens. Dr. Laufter and Dr. Roberts, do either of you have any advice for parents of picky eaters? We'll start with you, Dr. Laufter.
I always like to tell parents when they ask me in the office about this, that you're not alone. I think parents feel that, oh my gosh, my kid is the worst. And this is a big part of what we discuss all day with our patients. So I think most importantly, kind of echoing what Dr. Ward had said about getting them involved, just making eating a positive experience, not running after them with food, not threatening with food. Try to eat together as a family. If they're really picky, you can get creative with trying to throw some healthy ingredients into smoothies, baked goods. There are often picky eating menus online that you can find for toddlers. For those parents whose kids are in daycare, even if looking at the menus that they're posting for what they're feeding the kids, sometimes trying to recreate those meals can help, especially if it's something that they're used to eating and used to eating around their friends. Cooking with them, offering just a variety of foods, just overall, as I mentioned, just trying to make it as positive as possible. And know that this phase usually is just transient.
Dr. Roberts?
Just to echo some kind of things that are being mentioned for kids that are on the older ends, a part of allowing them to take part in the food prep is also giving them control over something that they might not have control over, and that might be something that's helping. When we let my daughter, who's on the pickier end of thing, pick out food in the store, she talks about it all week until we have that meal. It might not be a bad idea to meal plan as a family activity Sunday in grocery shops. They can take an active part in, what everything does, or everything that's going to come in the week. That might make them a little bit more willing to try things and try different cultural foods, different spices. There's a lot of fairly healthy spices that if they like, you can apply to a lot of different foods to get them to eat them. And just try different colors, different shapes, different textures. If a kid doesn't like a food, it may not be the taste, it may just be the texture they don't like, or some people have more sensitivity to bitter vegetables. So if they limit themselves to a couple different fruits or vegetables or a couple different meats that they eat frequently, that's probably okay.
Yeah, I would echo what everybody said. A couple of points in particular. One, as Dr. Ward mentioned, don't make this a battle. You're not going to win. So really, dinner time, any meal time should be a source of pleasure for everybody involved. So try not to make a big deal about it. Your kid's going to be fine. And the other thing I would say is, if you find that your child is a picky eater, don't try and find an unhealthy substitute that they'll eat, thinking that they have to eat something, right? My advice would be, make the meal and maybe give them one other option. And if they don't like it, then okay, then they'll be fine. Nobody's going to starve themselves to death. Or starve themselves into illness even. So I wouldn't say, well, you have to eat something. So here, have the French fries, have the potato chips, have the ice cream and chocolate sauce, just to eat something. That's probably not a good method to follow. All right. So this next question is a three-parter, and I'd like each of you to handle one part of it. Dr. Laufter, you're first. For newborns coming home during the pandemic, what advice do you have for allowing family to see the baby? And again, this is family. How soon? Should they be masked or unmasked? Should they be social distanced or not? What can you tell parents about that situation?
Well, Fortunately, per the CDC, COVID infections in neonates, newborns are uncommon, and the majority of confirmed cases are either asymptomatic or mild disease, but it's still something we don't want to take a chance with if we can control it. I'm sure everybody's aware that cases are rising across the country, so recommendations should be getting stricter rather than looser. The safest advice I would give for anybody, any family members coming to visit a newborn, would be to just have them follow the CDC guidelines about masking and washing their hands prior to holding the baby. We still are using an exposure as within 15 minutes of a person, 15 minutes with a person within 6 feet of them. So if you're holding a baby, you're obviously within 6 feet of them. So having them masked is really just going to take a lot of risk off the table. If there's somebody who's unvaccinated who wants to come to see the baby, but doesn't want to mask, the safest course of action for them would be to quarantine at home for 2 weeks prior to visiting, just to really decrease the risk of any possible exposure. But even for vaccinated individuals, it's still the safest measure to be masking and washing their hands prior to holding the baby.
Thank you. Dr. Ward, this next one's for you. One parent wants to know if they should quarantine when bringing the new baby home, if the parents should quarantine.
So I think, I think the short answer to that question is probably no, as long as, parents are being careful about what they're, for the parents, about, what they're doing, wearing their mask, washing their hands, that sort of thing. And there may also be some benefit. I think about that question, not just the parents, but also if there's any other family members. I mean, it really might be beneficial, depending on what they're doing, to keep some of the if they're siblings, let them have some of their normal routine, being safe, making sure that whatever those activities are, they're doing what they should be doing. But for the baby, I think, that baby, I would think about sort of like quarantining. And this isn't just COVID related. This is the same advice that I would give a newborn, parents of a newborn anyway. Those babies are susceptible to lots of other illnesses, RSV, pertussis, even colds can be, more severe in small babies. And so the baby, I think, should, for the most part, stay home. You can take your baby outside for walks when it's nice out, and be outside, and but I would avoid taking them to a restaurant or store or something like that. And then, of course, it's important to keep those regular pediatrician appointments, and feel safe bringing them to the pediatrician and, lactation consultant or whatever those early appointments are. So I think for the parents, no, as long as they're, following recommendations with what they should be doing.
Thank you. And I would just reiterate, even before COVID, the one thing that we always stressed was that anybody who's around the baby, daycare workers, nannies, grandma, grandpa, aunts and uncles, anybody who's coming over should be immunized against diseases that really are very dangerous for newborns at this age. During the flu season, that's a flu vaccine, so getting an influenza shot. And then at any time, it's pertussis. Mothers generally get a pertussis shot either during their pregnancy or soon after delivery. Fathers are offered the same. But anybody who comes over and handles the baby should be up to date with their pertussis shot. Even if you had one years and years ago, the immunity wanes, so you need a more recent one. So make sure that everybody who comes by is fully immunized against those two diseases in particular. All right, Dr. Roberts, the last question is, what about non-family visitors who want to see the baby? What do you tell parents?
I agree with everything that's been said, about keeping the family careful, and family, non-family visitors would be treated the same. In this situation, I think it's fair to limit visitors to people that have received the vaccine. And then the vaccine, it's not 100%, as we all know, when cases are rising. So I think having masking as a recommendation before they visit is okay. The thing to understand is families can be challenging, friends can be challenging. But ultimately, if your child's sick, it's going to be it can be a fairly terrifying thing that you're going to have to manage, and you have to do what's best for you and your family. And if people may not be on board with your plan for visiting, and I think the simplest way isn't to enter into a combative situation or conflict. It's just not, we're going to say no, we're just very worried, and this is the path we want to take to say yes for you to visit. I think most people will be understanding, and if they've had their own children or have young ones, they'll be understanding. But ultimately, it's your comfort level. I think with everything going on, it is a risk to the kids that's preventable.
And this is when you can blame on us. Blame your pediatrician, blame any of us, blame me personally if you want. And say, the doctors say this is what we got to do, so we got to follow doctor's orders, right? So don't get into a big conflict. All right. One parent wants to know, what is the youngest age you'd recommend a child getting the COVID vaccine if they are approved for children under the age of 12, as they currently are, in the near future? Dr. Laufter, what's your answer?
My answer would be to trust the CDC and the vaccine companies and go with the lowest age that it becomes available for. So I know we're all hopeful for fall. Things are looking like it may be closer to winter, but I'm anxiously awaiting to vaccinate my 3-year-old twins. And I would hope that my parents, the parents of my patients, can follow my lead and know that if I trust the vaccine, that they should too.
Thank you. I would agree. And you're right. It looks, the latest word is that it may not be till early or even midwinter before the age limit gets dropped, presumably to around 5 or 6. So it's going to be a few more months. Dr. Ward, another parent, asks, how can I help my 5-year-old daughter overcome paralyzing fear? For example, she refuses to ride a bike because she's afraid of falling off. She refuses to play with kids she doesn't know at the park due to fear. What do you tell that parent?
So the first thing is, remember, anxiety is a normal human emotion. So, we've all experienced some anxiety at some point. Kids especially have a lot of fears in that preschool, even toddler, preschool, early elementary age, they're scared of monsters and the dark, storms, burglars, meeting friends, the bathtub drain, I've heard, starting new activities. That's all normal. And some anxiety is good. It keeps us from jumping off the cliff or, doing something that we probably shouldn't do. And it also can, sort of push us to do our best in certain activities. Parents have a really strong influence here, sometimes without realizing it. Your goal is really to try to help your child manage their anxiety rather than completely eliminate it. Our natural tendency tends to be trying to take away that immediate distress so that everybody is feeling better, including ourselves, because sometimes it makes us anxious when our kids are feeling anxious. But really, that's not helpful in the long run. So, you should think about your goal, really trying to help your child feel more empowered, so that worry has less control over them. So we can use the bike, as sort of an example. I usually tell people to try to give your child some positive, realistic expectations. So, I wouldn't tell them you won't fall, because they probably will fall. But you can say, that it's going to be okay and we will be able to handle it when you fall, or, ask them what they're worried about specifically. So if they're worried about falling, then, well, what are we going to do to try to, make that feel better? We're going to wear a helmet and elbow pads and knee pads, and we have lots of Band-Aids and, that kind of thing. And I think, another place that sometimes this comes up is giving those realistic expectations when you're dropping your child off somewhere that maybe they're nervous about going to. So, a lot of times parents will sort of hang around for a couple minutes and peek in the window. And, that gives kids the sense that maybe I won't be okay. Like, why is my mom still hanging around? So, confidently give them some confidence by confidently, leaving them in situations they're going to be okay with. I think respecting their feelings of anxiety is really important. So, I think even just repeating back to them, like, I know that you're scared to fall, validate that feeling for them, and tell them that that's okay. So it's okay to feel anxious, but then how are we going to how are we going to deal with it? And one of the ways that sometimes I find is helpful is to actually give that worry a name. You can call it the worry, give it its place, you know. So what is the worry saying to you? You can ask kids, like, what is your worry saying to you? And they might say, well, that I'm, you know, going to fall, or I'll never be able to do it. And then sort of work through what might happen, what situations might happen, and how to prove that worry wrong. And then sometimes baby steps too. So if kids are really not, you know, riding a bike is too overwhelming, maybe you just put the helmet on and go sit on the bike for a little bit and see how that feels. And once that's comfortable, then, you know, break it down into some baby steps. A lot of times parents will ask, when do we need extra help? So when is what we're doing, you know, not enough? And when do we need some help from an outside source? And I usually just explain it to people like when what you're doing and trying has really not made a huge difference, or it's paralyzing fear and you're really not able to work through it, or it's preventing your child from doing some of their normal activities, or, you know, interfering with social interactions, then it's never wrong to ask for some extra help, and your pediatrician will be able to, you know, set you up with a therapist or a counselor that might help you with some strategies to sort of work through some of those things.
Thank you. That's very good advice. I would reiterate that, you know, if particularly if the kids are going backwards, they didn't have fear and now they have fear, or the fear is really interfering with their social interactions, and despite your best efforts, you're not making much progress. You can certainly bring it up with your pediatrician, who can offer some good advice like Dr. Ward did. But if that's not helping, many PediaTrust offices do have counselors on staff, and they can either meet with your child in person, you and your child in person, or through a telemedicine visit. So be sure to ask about that. All right, thank you, Dr. Ward. Very sage advice. This next question is for Dr. Roberts, and it's a very good one and timely. Our school district just decided not to require masks for kids this upcoming school year. My kids are too young to be vaccinated. They're in elementary school. What should we do? Dr. Roberts?
So the American Academy of Pediatrics recently came out with a statement. I believe it was released Monday, recommending masking for return to school. They are recommending full in school, and they're recommending masking as it's not reasonable to expect all kids to have been vaccinated, or in areas where the majority of kids will be below approved age, or having a policy where masked people don't, unvaccinated masks and vaccinated don't, isn't reasonable to constantly monitor. So they have put out a stance that does recommend masking for all people in school. And the CDC and your general pediatricians are all going to stand behind that statement. There's a bit of time before school starts, and the decision by the school district may be a little bit premature. As cases are rising and there's a new statement, I think it'd be important to work with your community and to approach your Board of Education or involve your general pediatricians to contact to say there's a change in the statement and it's recommending going forward that we do masking.
Right. Things can change between now and the beginning of the school year in another month or so. And I think many school districts, the board or the administration, superintendent, really want to hear from parents. So make your voice heard, write a letter, send an email, make a phone call, get as many of your fellow parents involved. And that's how things change. Okay. Dr. Laufter, sleep is an issue at all ages, from the time the baby comes out until they leave for college. When is a good time to sleep train a child, and what do you think is the best way to do that?
Well, we generally recommend, if you are planning to sleep train on the earlier end, that around 4 to 6 months is usually the earliest where we see the most success. So there can be a 4-month sleep regression, and after that is over, usually between that time and 6 months, infants are learning to self-soothe. So that is a big part of your sleep training, is making sure that they are able to soothe themselves back to sleep if they do wake up. So, because most babies will wake up. So it also coincides with the time that many infants are able to go throughout the night without a feeding. So of course, you'll be checking in with their pediatrician to make sure that their growth curve looks adequate for this. If your child does have, certain healthcare issues, if they were premature, for example, it may be something that the pediatrician may recommend pushing back, but that's something you can discuss with him or her. So in general, you want to start establishing a routine and looking for signs of sleepiness. Make sure that you've kind of gone throughout a couple days. I always tell parents to record the time that you're putting them down to nap, report the times that they're waking up, the time that they're going to bed at night, just so you can kind of start to see what their sleep-wake cycle is. Literature shows that this can even be established as early as 6 weeks. So by 4 to 6 months, this should be much more evident. And always that we're trying to avoid the overtired. For any parent who has had an overtired child, this is very real and very scary. So even signs of being overtired include those things that most parents think are just a sign of starting to get sleepy, but they can be too late, where they're starting to actually rub their eyes and get cranky. We want to look for more subtle signs, such as the baby's just making less noise or moving around less than they normally do when they're fresh after a nap. So if you start to see that they're getting a little bit quieter, a little bit more still, you may want to think about starting your routine for either nap or bed. You want to try to stick to a similar routine between nap time and between bedtime. You want to put them on their backs to sleep on a nice, soft but firm surface. Have the body warm but the room cool. And that in general, this is a process. And if the child is screaming uncontrollably, it may show that they're really not ready to give up that feeding. We talk a little bit about something called graduated extinction, where you go into the room to check on them if they are crying, but you go for, fewer and fewer minutes each time, or you wait longer and longer minute-wise before you go back in to check on them. So those are all different techniques that you can consider when you're attempting this somewhat difficult process.
Thank you. And obviously there's lots of books out there about this, so plenty of help available. While we're on the subject of sleep, I have a question for Dr. Ward. It's very specific. One parent writes, why do toddlers sometimes wake up from naps incredibly upset and inconsolable?
I love this question. I'm so glad somebody asked it. My own daughter does this. And, you think about babies taking a nap or toddlers taking a nap, and they should be well rested. And, my boys talk to themselves and were very happy when they woke up. And my daughter is inconsolable, only at my house, not at the babysitter's house. So, I went through a whole list of things. Could it be this? Could it be that? And I'll tell you some of the things maybe to look for, but in the end, it's probably something else. So one could be not enough sleep or waking up too early from a nap. For sure can do it. So some kids will only sleep through one sleep cycle, wake up in 45 minutes, be really upset that they're awake, and actually need a much longer nap. So that's something to look for. Sometimes when kids are overtired, their naps get really short. So, not missing that window. Too much sleep sometimes can do it and really mess with naps. So when kids approach the age of 2, they start needing a little bit less sleep. So you're used to putting those kids to bed at 6 or 7, and maybe they need to go to bed just a little bit later. I thought, could she be hungry? Maybe she's starting to take this long nap in the middle of the day, and lunch was few hours ago. So is she waking up hungry? Is she scared of something in her room? Is she uncomfortable? Is it too hot, too cold? Does she like me less than she likes her babysitter? But really, it probably is something called confusional arousal. which can happen in toddlers. Actually, up to 17%, I think is what I read, of young kids can have this, and it's much less common as you move into adolescence and adulthood. But these kids, usually it's with naps specifically, but they wake up consolable and sometimes hysterical after sleeping. And I think about it kind of like they're jolted out of their sleep too quickly, and their body and their mind is really just very disoriented about being awake, and they just need some time to recognize that they're awake. You know, sometimes it helps a little bit if you can kind of whisk them away to an activity. So, you know, sort of really quickly move into the high chair for a snack, or, you know, take them outside, or sort of transition. And sometimes they really just need to be held. And, you know, usually kids will outgrow it by age 5. And, you know, our favorite parenting mantra is to shall pass. So it should disappear.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. And our last sleep question is for Dr. Roberts. There's actually 2 questions, but they're somewhat related. I can hear the frustration in the voice of this parent as they type this. Why does my 1.5-year-old son wake up every 4 hours during the night? And then another parent writes, and why does my kid wake up every day at 5:55 a.m. regardless of bedtime? I can almost hear the shouting coming through on the typewriter there. All right, Dr. Roberts, what do you say?
So for the 18-month-old to start, I think I would consider what the whole day schedule is. You might be hitting a point where 2 naps is too much and 1 is not enough. And if you're on a 2-nap schedule with an 18-month-old, there might be a habit of waking up essentially almost every 4 hours. So one thing I would say is if you have a consistent kind of wake up time, try and push to 1 nap per day, and then try and hit a point where you end that first nap and you have about 6 hours in between when they're going to go to bed, when you want to put them down for the night, and when they get up for that nap. It's going to be kind of a challenging times, because you might, let's say you put them down, you know, around 11 or so, and then they're up at 2, and then our goal bedtime is 8 o'clock. Around 6 o'clock, you're going to be hanging out with a very difficult person. But sometimes when you break the habit of them waking that frequently, you're able to get them to sleep a little bit through the night. Kids at that age, they don't have nutritional needs at night. They have enough sugar stores and fat stores in their body and blood to get them through. So if they've been trained to kind of eat at night, that's a habit to break. If they're waking up at after 4 hours and they want milk, you just kind of have to cut that out. If they won't let up, you can offer maybe 2 ounces of water or something like that and slowly get that away. But I think the first thing is to correct the nap schedule for during the day and see if that improves night. Then at night, it's just kind of reapplying some of the kind of aforementioned sleep strategies. Let them get up if they're fussing and rolling around their bed, but they're not crying for you and they're up for a while. That's perfectly okay. They're entertaining and they're self-soothing, and then they'll go back to bed. And then I would kind of keep a fairly consistent wake-up time in the morning. The cure for the second question, if I could bottle that, that'd be great. That's perfectly normal for kids to have a consistent wake-up time. And if you do something to alter that morning wake-up time, you might have something that happens in the night that messes with the bedtime. So you might trade one issue for another. And I think adjusting the schedule to match that wake-up time is the best thing. I've been stuck there for a long time with my second one. And on vacation, it'd be nice if we get up a little bit later, but you know, the things are what they are, but there is no harm in them waking up at the same time every day, and altering that natural kind of schedule for them might change how they sleep through the night.
Yes, I agree. It's difficult to change that wake up time. That's just the way the kid is wired. And my only advice is caffeine. So Dr. Laufter, this question came in from the chat, and I'd like to ask it of you. The question is it okay to play sensory videos on the TV for infants about 3 months old? And how much exposure to TV is okay in the daily life as the rest of the family watches TV throughout the day? What do you say to that, Mom?
So I think 3 months is pretty young. I don't think that they would need sensory videos on TV. I think, with toys and just movement around them, that their sensory needs are being met. Their visual acuity is also not that strong at 3 months. I would really push it back to much older. The AAP really doesn't recommend screen time at all until about 18 to 24 months, with the exception of just like FaceTiming with friends and family. I know that's hard, but I would definitely urge more just in-person, hard, toys, books, images that you can do in front of them interactively at that young of an age.
Thank you. I think that's very wise. Dr. Roberts, we had several questions about children who, quote unquote, don't listen well and misbehave. You see, you're laughing. Do you have any advice for parents regarding discipline, specifically preschoolers and even school-age children?
The three-nager stage. Yeah, they push every limit they can, essentially. And I think the biggest thing is not one that we ourselves need to stay calm. Kids are generally going to raise their anxiety level to the anxiety level in the room. And if they perceive you as angry, it's going to say, well, it's okay for me to be angry. And their ability to kind of communicate and listen and process is going to be really low. So I think once they're starting to escalate, keeping everything to short sentences and repeat directions and clear instructions is okay. And don't try to reason with them. If they're just going to argue back everything you say. And you have to separate them from the situation. I like to use timeout, the 1 minute per year. So, and the biggest thing about timeout, it's not just the time, because it's not a punishment. It's a means to reset yourself so that you can reinsert yourself into a playing safely. Time starts when you're calm. So if you tell them not to do something, this is timeout, and they're still kind of throwing a tantrum, why this, why that? It's not why, it's time starts when you're calm. You don't have to give them an explanation. And then the most important thing is going to be when their time is done. And if it takes them 10, 15 minutes to sit calmly for a 3-minute timeout, that's perfectly fine. The more that they understand that you're not going to give, it's going to make things easier for you down the road. Some kids, it might take tons of interactions for this to work. It's not going to be an instant thing. And if they're challenging you on it, it doesn't mean that you're doing anything incorrectly. It's just you might have a more challenging child. And I think once timeout is done, the most important thing is going to be kind of processing, well, why did we have to do timeout? Why did we have to stay? And allowing them to understand what led them to be here. And then allowing them, then the idea is that once they're calm, once they've done their time, they're allowed to go back to playing in a way that's going to be safe for themselves and other people.
Thank you. Very helpful. Dr. Ward, we got another question that came in through the chat, and I'm going to direct this one to you. Other than PediaTrust doctors, the CDC, and the AAP, are there any other sources that you would trust for sound and honest COVID vaccine information or advice? It is almost impossible to block out the news media, both online and on TV. I agree. Well, those are 3 good sources.
Right.
Not sure you need to go much beyond that, but I'll let you answer.
I mean, that's pretty much exactly what I was going to say. So it is really difficult. Sometimes there is a lot of information. It's been all over the news for a really long period of time now. And it really is sometimes difficult to tease out, what is reality and what isn't. Those 3 sources, I think, really are definitely the top ones. The CDC has really good information. The AAP, which obviously is comprised from pediatricians all over the country, and then your own pediatrician. We really have been living and breathing this, just like all parents have this entire time. But things are constantly changing, and so it is really hard to keep up with all the information. But we are all doing it with you, and many of us are parents ourselves, and we have the best interest of your children at heart. And so I would say, reach out to your pediatrician, even as things change, if you have any questions. But the CDC and the AAP are also really good resources.
Thank you. All right, this question also came in this evening on the chat. I'm going to send this one to Dr. Laufter. the question is, at what age should we actively practice sitting up with our infant? I assume that means getting the infant to sit up. And also rolling if the infant isn't already showing signs at 12 weeks. Dr. Laufter, what do you say?
So we don't generally see an infant sit until about 6 or 7 months. So generally 6 months with support. So kind of where they're on the couch holding their arms out, but they may roll over, and closer to 7 months unsupported. And of course, things can change based upon if they were premature or if they have neuromuscular issues. So I wouldn't be nervous if you're not really seeing much core strength by 12 weeks because we don't expect it. But some parents are interested in getting the kids in the high chair by 4 to 6 months to start feeding them. So I would say, as long as the head control is strong and your pediatrician recognizes it as normal, usually around the 4-month mark, you can start putting them in a high chair. But as far as sitting independently, we don't see that closer to 6 to 7 months. There are bumbo seats and other different chairs that you can put your kids in to practice that, but we generally don't want them seated in those chairs for really longer than about 20 minutes. We want them out and about, moving. We just don't want them stationary all the time. And of course, if you're cooking dinner, if you need to make a phone call a couple feet away and if you need just a little bit of time, of course, that's okay to have them seated there, just not for much longer. And then as far as rolling goes, we generally don't start seeing rolling of belly to back until about 4 months. And then the other way, back to belly until about 6 months. So, and even with the really larger babies, the nice big chubby ones, sometimes it can be even a little bit later just because of inertia. But we still want to encourage it. And the hardest part for a baby to move when they're rolling is getting that hip turn. So you can even start with just turning the hip, giving them a little bit of a head start and seeing if just naturally the rest of the body will follow. It is our job to tell you at each of the well child visits if there are any concerns with muscle tone or what their developmental stages are. So I wouldn't be nervous until we're nervous.
Good advice. I would reiterate, it seems like there's a new device every week that comes out marketed to parents for, getting your kid to sit up or do this or do that. And most of that stuff is probably unnecessary and may even cause some other problems. So the only thing that I recommend to parents early on in those first few months is a lot of tummy time. Mm-hmm. So kids often don't like to be on their tummies for very long periods of time. So you just got to do it frequently. So, lots and lots of tummy time will help build up some of those core muscles. All right. This question is one that came in written. Dr. Ward, it's a timely question. Our child was a remote student since the pandemic began. What are some techniques we can apply to help the anxiety they may feel as the new school year approaches and in-person attendance is the only option?
So there definitely is can be a lot of anxiety around this upcoming school year for all of us, just because of the uncertainty. So we saw that with last school year and things were constantly changing, but the same really, is to be said for this year. I think most schools are going back fully in person, but we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And so, that can be really anxiety inducing. I think the first thing to do is sort of check your own feelings about going back to school, because we do project a lot of that onto our kids without realizing it or without meaning to. And so just check your own emotions. If you're really nervous for them to go back, try not to, talk about that too much and, keep it separate from what your kids are hearing. And then I think the the biggest thing is to ask your kids how they're feeling about it. And obviously older kids might be able to verbalize that a little bit better than younger kids, but definitely continue those conversations up, up until school starts, and then after school starts, what they're seeing, how they're feeling, how they're adjusting. Some of the things that we talk about for back to school anyway will still help in this situation. So, a couple weeks before school starts, which is quickly approaching, work on those new morning routines and starting to go to bed a little bit earlier, pushing that bedtime back slowly. And then I think too, depending on your child, some kids do better with talking about it, and some you want to talk about it, but not too early. For some kids, talking about some of those changes, you start talking about it and talking about it, and they start thinking about it and thinking about it, and it makes the anxiety more. So talking about it, but not too early, I think that will help.
Thank you. I'm going to send this next one to Dr. Roberts, and this will be our last question. And it came in just a minute or so ago on the chat. Some cultures allow introducing organic cow's milk or goat milk very early to an infant, especially if their mother isn't making enough breast milk. And parenthetically, the parent says, according to my mom, I was put on cow milk within the second month. How do you feel about that? What can you tell us about why we don't recommend that, Dr. Roberts?
The issue with milk is that it's just not complete. Things like breast milk, the contents of it are going to be different than cow's milk. A lot of the vitamins, antibodies, and cholesterol, vitamins, minerals, everything that are included in breast milk are just not present in cow's milk. The big one with goat's milk is it doesn't have folate, which is a really important thing for the production of red blood cells. So kids that tend to start on cow milk early tend to be nutritionally deficient, and they tend to have high rates of anemia. Iron is really important for brain growth especially. So it's something that we need to avoid until children are 12 months old. And the formulas that are generally cow's milk based are supplemented with all of the things we need, in addition to different types of fats, vitamins, and minerals to closely mimic the contents of breast milk. There's a lot of options for some moms that aren't producing. I know donor milk has become a bigger thing. There is a couple pharmacies that do distribute it, appropriately collected, purified breast milk. So that's an option for people that want to steer away from formulas. But as an alternative, we wouldn't recommend goat's milk or cow's milk due to the risk for vitamin deficiency and anemia.
Right. And in some cases, it's a little rarer, but in some cases, cow's milk has been shown to actually cause some gastrointestinal bleeding in kids that young, and you don't see it. So it can be, so just something to be aware of. There's several good reasons to avoid milk in those early months, and really up until the child is about 12 months old. All right, well, it's a little past 7 actually. I want to thank everybody who was on the call with both the Zoom chat and the Facebook Live. We got a lot of people on that platform. So we'll wrap this up. I want to thank our panelists for tonight, Dr. Ward, Dr. Laufter, and Dr. Roberts. Thank you very much. Very sage advice tonight. And if you have any other questions, obviously you can ask your PediaTrust pediatrician at your next checkup. Our next webinar will be next month in August, and it'll be focusing on back to school issues with an obvious emphasis on COVID and the vaccine and all the things that relate to that. So we will be sending out an email, as I mentioned, to everybody who registered for the event, for this event, with the recording for this webinar this evening, so you can watch it in its entirety if you happen to miss anything tonight. So thanks again to our panelists, and I hope everybody has a good weekend. Safe.